thank you very much, Sean Hinton, for taking the time to, he's in the airport at the moment in Stockholm, where we're going to not just talk about governance, but really the underlying assumption of governance. And what is our underlying assumption about human beings? And therefore, what kind of governance structure will actually be driven through those, through our understanding, our thinking of governance. Sean has a wonderful curriculum. I wouldn't even start to describe it. I'll just say that right now, he's a CEO of the Soros Economic Development Fund. And he has a broad career that spans continents, again, from China to Mongolia, to Oxford, to the US. And we're just really happy to have you on board. And Sean, I hand over to you to introduce briefly your session. Thank you very much.
Let me start with a conundrum and a question. And I'd like to then ask each of the people on the call to introduce themselves, just to say one word, if you would, about who you are, what you do, where you live. I'd love you to give me your answer to this problem. Many of you will know the great Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen. And he has an extraordinary book called An Idea of Justice. And in the book, he poses this conundrum. He says you're walking down the street and you come across three children fighting in the street. And they're fighting over a flute. And one of the children, Anne, says that the flute should be given to her because she is the only one of the three who knows how to play the flute. And if it's given to her, she can play it for the benefit of others, and she can do something with the flute. The second child, Bob, says, no, the flute should be given to him because the others have so many things. Both the other children have so many toys, so many things to do. He has none. He has no toys. So for him, he is entitled to the flute. And the third child, Carla, says the flute should be hers, quite simply because she made the flute. She spent the time and the care and the effort and the resources. This flute is the fruit of her labor. Now, how do you settle the problem? How do you decide between these three legitimate claims? The claim of capacity, the claim of need, and the claim of ownership. But I'd love your response to that conundrum.
Let's see if I got the instructions right. Daniel Turin from Spain. I serve at ebbf. I've got the best job ever. And my answer is I was tending towards capacity. I would give it to the people, the individual that can do the most, make the most happen through it, through whatever is been given.
I'm Suzanne, and I'm from Finland, and I teach, mostly adults. I think the one who made the flute should teach the other two how to make flutes of their own. I think the one who knows how to play the flute should teach the other two how to play the flute. Then everybody has flutes and everybody knows how to play the flutes.
In Switzerland, and I'm a business consultant, and I tend to help people solve complex problems. I look at it as justice has got two components, process and outcome. If it was made by someone, then it's still the possession of that person. So taking it away from that person without just to take it away for someone else isn't fair. So on that case, I would look at it as a couple possibilities. One is they can find out some way to work out an exchange so that, similar to what Suzanne said, perhaps the person who knows how to play it could teach the others, and the one who makes it could make another one. But again, I'm not a fan of taking things away from people who made them without any kind of exchange. That doesn't pass either the process or the outcome test.
I was, I have my baby, my playing baby just right next to me. But it's definitely, my name is Cindy. I live in Miami. I'm Mexican. I've been mainly working on corporate responsibility. Right now, I'm staying at home with my newborn baby. Well, not newborn. And it's an interesting one. I will say it's definitely a difficult one. My initial reaction was to go with capacity as well, because maybe this person can teach the others and hopefully share on how to play the flute so they can all enjoy having the flute, because just having it for the sake of having it, if they don't want it, if they don't, well, they want it, but if they will not put it in a good use, maybe it's not the best outcome. So I will say mainly the one that can have some use for it and maybe teach them how to play it.
Carl, and I am English, as has already been apologised for, and I live in Switzerland. I work in training, facilitation, helping teams, coaching, and I also have a sideline of photography. I liked every answer that everybody has given to this point, increasingly agreeing with everybody who spoke last. So I thought I'd better get in here quick before there's any more answers which will confuse me even further. I'm reluctant to impose a solution from the outside on the three of them, and I would like to engage the three of them into some collaborative discussions to actually see whether or not there's a way that they could find a way of setting aside their original opinions and needs and seeing whether or not they can actually build something bigger than the three of them initially presented in order to get something different out of it through some kind of consultative process.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Caban. I work as an executive coach and as an entrepreneur in Brazil right now. And my tendency will be to focus on capacity, as I believe that, of course, we need to create a fair world where people can develop the capacity. But if we give the instrument to someone that has a higher capacity, I believe we can add more value quickly. Let's say it's a more efficient way, of course, without disconsidering the others finding a way to build it.
Hi everyone, my name is Maria, and I think my answer goes with my profession. I work for the Brazilian government with public policies for small agriculture, small farmers. And I think that children with that needs should be given the flute, because I think the other two children will get more benefit from giving it to the one that needs than having the flute.
Hi everyone, this is Gigi, and like Daniel said, I live in Switzerland. I'm currently working at a trade union called Uni Global Union, and I represent professional athletes across the world. And so something that I'm I think obliged to say in my professional capacity is agreeing with an earlier comment. I would probably seek to have the three children negotiate or consultatively find a solution for how they would resolve this question of the flute. But I think from my background as a policymaker, I would focus on the child with need, because I think rising inequality is fueling a lot of instability in the world. And as many of the previous comments alluded to, there are ways to generate more ownership and more capacity, or through the capacity and through the ownership, education and more creation. There would be additional flutes to go around, and this child with need, if deprived of having the flute, I think that could lead to further instability and further inequality.
I'm Madalina. I'm from Bucharest, and I work in community building. And I worked a lot with entrepreneurs. So I think my answers will be influenced by this. First of all, I don't like the idea of having an external authority taking the decision. And even if we have this, I think that we don't know the whole story and the context. For example, we don't know if the girl that has the capacity wants to use that capacity, and if she wants to use it in a good way or for the others, or in just an egoist way. The kid that has the need, we don't know, he has the need for toys, but we don't know if he or she likes the flute or if it's useful for him or she. And the one that made the flute, yes, it's the owner because it's his or her creation. And these are just some assumptions or just some questions to emphasize the thing that we don't know the full picture. And what I would do, I don't know, create a space for conversation between them and consultation, like you said, and invite them to co-create together a solution that might be useful for them and maybe for others. And in the same time, I would add the dimension of time, because the flute is a resource. And even if we give it to just one person, that person will not use it the whole time. So maybe they can share it or exchange it, or I don't know, find a schedule in which all three of them could benefit.
If it's stopping the fighting, then I will just keep the flute for myself. And then if there's no more flute, there may not be any more fight. Learning music and for the different people to have it, then in that case, it would also be different. But I think cooperation among the three and being able to very much have each of them use their purpose or their intent within that particular framework of the flute would be my preferred approach, I think.
Think at the moment is that I would not be able to make any decisions better than the one that they could make themselves. So I would really just create the space for them to figure it out by themselves, and asking them the questions on what is the purpose, or if there is any solutions that is not just one person owning it for the whole time, and support some of the aspects that Madalina also mentioned. But I would, I would create the space for them to figure out how they prefer to deal with this situation rather than imposing something externally.
Let me summarize some of the things I heard. I heard a number of people talk about process, and that was interesting. So some people took the bait and talked about one of those answers, but many people talked about process, talked about them co-creating, them consulting, them being brought together in a process, which I think is a fascinating and an important answer. But it begs the question, how? How will they do it? Now we have 3 children, and those 3 children, like us, have different approaches. They have different conceptual frameworks, different views. And what's going to govern the balance of those conversations? Is it going to be power? Is it going to be how are the dynamics going to be regulated by which they will co-create the answer? So I think that, you know, that's a partial answer, but in a way it's sort of pushing the question a little bit down the road, because it still leaves us with the same question that we have faced as a group. Well, let's us co-create it. Well, we find that we have very different views amongst us. And it's not, so let's keep going. I heard many people for capacity, some people for need, and no one spoke for ownership or rights. Nobody spoke for, you know, the person made it, for goodness sake.
One person, James.
One person. And then I was going to say the final category was that many asked questions. Many of you said, well, it depends. It kind of depends. It depends on whether this or whether that. It depends on how you view this and how you view that. And of course, I think I was safe in asking a question and asking, you know, and sort of inviting lots of answers, because there isn't an answer. And I think it begs the question of whether we have seen any institutional arrangements, any governance arrangements that we could agree on that would resolve this in a universally acceptable way. Do we have any models, anything that we can see in the corporate world, in the legal world, in the political world, in the social sphere, where we could reliably say that question will be resolved in a universally acceptable way, in a way that is seen as fair and just by all? Amartya Sen, who poses the question in his book, says that there aren't. He says that basically his answer is the same, which is it sort of depends. And he sort of implies that without a shared conception of justice, without a conception of justice that's multidimensional, that is universal, that resolves the value we attach to the pursuit of human fulfillment, the value we attach to the removal of poverty, the value we attach to our entitlement to enjoy the fruits of our labor. That without some concept of justice that resolves those things, we don't even know how to have the conversation, because we're talking fundamentally without a sort of shared framework, without a common language. And so as a result, in society, because there's been no common ground and we haven't had a shared vision of universal justice, so what we revert to is rules. We revert to the technical solution, because that at least we can manipulate, that at least we can do something about. So we apply what are essentially contractual solutions, contractual arrangements to decisions, to people, to procedures, to laws, to actions, to events. We sort of respond to them with this technical solutions, and we sort of build from the ground up. We establish methods of governance and frameworks of governments with a vision, without a vision of what we're building. And clearly, I think most of us would agree that that approach hasn't yielded the sort of results that we might expect or we might want. And the few models, the few visions that have been promoted, the sort of big dominant visions of justice and of how to address that question, have not created the outcomes that they claimed to produce. They haven't created a just world. Experience of being involved in the management of a company in deep distress, where with what we would assume are the very highest standards of corporate governance, under the watchful eye of all of the layers of governance, all of the complex rules associated with a listed company in 2 jurisdictions. And yet it was entirely inadequate to control even the most gross violations of behavior. It focused on simple metrics, simple rules, and totally failed to observe and to provide leadership over the culture and the behavior of the organization. This was an organization that was, under investigation in multiple territories for corruption and violations, and yet none of those sort of governance mechanisms had in any sense worked. So, the sort of the failings, even if we don't apply a vision of justice that implies a sort of equal or at least a more equitable distribution, even if we just look at the intent of these institutions to govern basic behavior, we see how flawed they are. How we govern and the results of how we govern say a lot about the fundamental concepts that we hold about the nature of man. So if we go beyond justice, I think there are a number of other sort of dimensions. A temporary coalition, a temporary intersection of shared interests and negotiated common ground solutions, which could at any time fracture into different factions, and were those interests not met, she would feel no compunction but to create a faction that would drive another answer. And it was an extraordinarily harsh view of the dynamics of a group that was all about this contest of power. In my work at the moment, we're doing a great deal of work with feminist economists in various contexts. And feminist economists are increasingly critiquing this kind of male-dominated notion of power. They're questioning why the work that women do, the work that women do in the home, the work that women do in domestic work, so much of the all of the economic value that so many of the female population of the planet is not calculated in GDP. It's not recognized as of value. It's not counted as economic output. And they're asking whether there aren't other forms of power, other forms of value that currently our frameworks are just not recognizing. And whether there aren't other forms of power that need to be recognized and need to be promoted and need to be built into governance, and incentives need to be created for people to be able to explore a less male-dominated view of power. And so we go on and we can talk about, you know, knowledge and how knowledge is developed and who contributes to it. We're doing a great deal of work at the moment in the area of participation. And how can we build participation of individual citizens into various forms of economic decision making? We're looking at that in the sense of economic decision making, in budgeting, and in economic decision making in governmental contexts, but also in corporate contexts. And what are the different structures of ownership and the different forms of collective ownership that might yield greater degrees of participation? And I'll close with a final sort of story. I had a fascinating visit recently to Spain to visit Mondragon. It's quite an extraordinary business. It's one of the largest businesses in the Spanish economy. It's actually a sort of a conglomerate of 102 different cooperatives in the Basque region. It has $12 billion of income, 70,000 people, 74,000 employees, and it has a huge range of businesses. It's a big conglomerate. It makes everything from robots to banks to insurance companies. It's a massive cooperative. And it is 100% worker owned. And it has an extraordinary system of governance. It was like seeing gravity not operate, things that you know have to be the case that don't seem to be operating. There is a maximum ratio between the lowest paid and the highest paid that's not allowed to exceed 8. It's not possible. That doesn't work. We know everywhere in the world that's an impossibility. It's not possible to attract and retain talent. And yet you can. If 25% of the workers in a cooperative decide to remove the general manager, they can do so. That shouldn't be possible. That shouldn't work. And it is an extraordinary experiment in participation in economic decision making and of ownership. And I'm very interested in that. And it questions the fundamentally cooperative, the assumptions that we make about the fundamental cooperative nature of man. So that was my short, long provocation and an invitation to help me think about the core aspects of human nature, that the forms of governance that we see in the world today, what do they suggest? And if we were to reframe forms of governance by examining what our core principles and our core beliefs are, and having a conversation about those very deep and fundamental issues, how might our systems of governance need to change?
I had a question, I just jump in, about what's not allowing people to go, because I think too many people feel they're constrained in their current situation and feel that that's the way things are. And to step away from that and be creative, be inventive, be innovative, unless there's a crisis, is not really that easy. So what is the incentive? Because justice is a great word, but for many people, what is just is that we make as much profit as possible. That's really just. That's the right thing to do. So I'm provoking here, and so how can we then allow these people to think in a different way? Because so many people are really, they would love to. That's what I keep hearing from people. I would love to do things a different way, but, and then they list a huge number of constraints that makes their life really terrible, horrible. I would not want to work there, but most people work in places they don't like. So how can they get out of, what have you found are ways to get out of the constraints of that's the way it should be done, that's the way it's measured, that's what people are counting me on at the end of the year or whatever, to really go back to the underlying assumptions and rethink this governance?
I think it helps to begin with your starting point. What do you believe about people? And there's certainly going back to 3rd century BC, there's this tradition of believing that people are created equal. In the Thomas Jefferson wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, all people are created equal. It shows up, it's in the Baha'i faith, it's in the variety of parts in the New Testament. Protestant Reformation, the idea that it's not a hierarchy, it's a much flatter organization because there's a belief that people are equal. Some of the challenge then becomes, if you take that belief, then the question becomes, how do you express that in an organization that is currently shaped more hierarchically? And so, but if you believe then that people have capacity, more people have more capacity than we commonly accept, but we force them into this particular structure, then the question then becomes, okay, what would the structures look like that might allow that fundamental belief to be present, to be active? An interesting twist is there's enough examples that say the structure actually doesn't matter. The physical, you can still have a pyramid. It's not about the physical structure, it's the relationship of power. How is power used in a structure? And I remember studying Aristotle. He had this idea of kingdom, aristocracy. So in the best form of government was kingdom, followed by aristocracy, followed by a polity, which was the government of the many. But each of these good forms also had a bad form. The good form was kingdom, the bad form was tyranny. The good form was aristocracy, the bad form was oligarchy. The good form is polity, the bad form is democracy. And therefore we want democracy not because it's the best, but because its bad form is the least bad. But this notion that in either structure you can have a good form and a bad form, let's not get hung up on structure. Let's look at how power is exercised within a structure.
My conception is very similar in terms of power dynamic change and not giving order as well. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Marshall Rosenberg, PhD, who has created a book, very famous one, Nonviolent Communication. And in this book, he talks about the domination paradigm we live in. So we live in a world which has a paradigm, a series of beliefs and values that reinforce each other, making it look like a reality. So the belief that we have to compete, that there is scarcity and we cannot all meet our needs, and we have to have power over in order to win, if not we lose. And there is fear, and there is a series of 10 different other things that he puts in these paradigms that reinforce each other, and it makes it a reality. Like we believe the world is a jungle, we believe all these things that justify oppression and inequalities and everything. And he explains in this book as well that there is a different way. And the different ways that he explores is based on a unity paradigm, let's say, where you have co-creation, where you have power with, where you have unity in diversity, where you have communication and abundance. And what he believes, I mean, one of the work that I'm doing in corporations as well and with people is using empathy. So in this book, it teaches you how to give yourself empathy. How can you be aware of your feelings and understand your needs behind the feelings and help yourself calm down your emotional levels and be connected with your own needs? And how can you do that to others? How can you help other people leave the intellectual area only and go to the feeling areas, and through the feelings, which are messengers of the need, connect to their own needs? And the needs are universal, they are human needs. So when we go to the human needs level, then we all have empathy and connect with each other, and we remove some of this paradigm of domination, and then we can start creating new forms of governance. That's
maybe we can also look at the functioning of the body as an example of organization, in which you have on one hand total disequality, inequality among its components. But this inequality doesn't mean being less or more important. This inequality doesn't mean that some are discriminated against. It just means that every single organ in that body knows exactly what it is supposed to do. and every other organ has full confidence that it will do what it has to do. In other words, it's not a question of hierarchy, but it's a question of full confidence and full collaboration. Obviously, translating that into human society requires to do what the body has done over millions of years, is that each organ has learned exactly what it is supposed to do. But when we define that in governance, we need that first definition of what each component of the society or a company or an organization, what is their ideal function. And once that function is defined, collectively co-created by everyone, then each can be given the liberty and the privilege of performing exactly what they know how to do, and the others believing that they will do it on time.
Daniel's sort of question, Daniel's provocation about how do we get out of this bind, you know, is a great one, and people are responding to that, I think, in different ways. I heard a couple. I heard, or I think I can see a couple of routes that we could take practically. I mean, you know, I want to be a little sort of practical here. One is to, you know, as they say, be the, as Gandhi said, be the change you want to be, right? So we can show people, we can create something that we can offer as an example of an alternative. So we can live something, we can create something that is a viable model of some aspect of that different vision of these essential things that we're talking about. The other thing we can do, of course, is we can share a vision of these things. So one is to sort of build a practical example of it. Another is to share a vision that others can turn to. And I think, you know, what Mahmoud was doing in sort of using that metaphor of the human body is finding in this case, a metaphor or an insight or a vision that might be a common point that others can sort of be drawn to or can see insight from. I think those are both, you know, viable and valid approaches to this justice, unless there is some sort of common yardstick against which people can use as a reference point. It's very difficult for those three children to co-create a solution. As attractive as the sort of intrinsic co-creation idea is, I think it's quite problematic, because if we only have our internal resources to draw on, if we expect the solution to come from the very elements that have created the terms of the problem, it becomes very difficult to craft a solution without turning to some point that is outside that system. As a provocation, can the three children themselves simply just sit down and talk and come up with a solution on their own? Do they have the ingredients, or do they not actually need to find some point outside the system? And in their case, in our reductive example, the system is three children fighting over a flute. But don't they need something outside of that system against which to measure the solution that they're going to try to co-create?
And I think younger children are much more capable of solving those problems together than perhaps teenagers and adults. There was an experiment done 100 years ago that put a bunch of rats in a space, stressed them out, and the rats responded with fight, flight, or fright. They froze, they fought each other, they ran away. Then about 80 years later, a woman scientist looked at that and noticed that most of the rats used were male rats. And she redid that same experiment, but with female rats, and they had a completely different response. So instead of fighting or running away or freezing, they had a tend and befriend or nurture response. Now, if you look hormonally at what produced that, it's essentially, oxytocin. That's sort of this hormone that allows us to bond with each other. It's much more present in women than in men. But beyond that, it's the effect of hormones on it. So one of the reasons that we bond with each other and can see we instead of I is because of oxytocin. Now, estrogen is sort of a multiplier. It's a coefficient. It multiplies the effect of oxytocin, and testosterone divides, it reduces the effect. So I think before you sort of get into that sort of very hormonal period where men are much more competitive, ready to fight or run away or freeze, they're more able to find that solution. But certainly once all that comes into play, it's much harder just because of the stretching between male and female hormonally. And so I think part of what you're seeing is this tension between, as you mentioned, there's a male model and a female model of leadership, but it's actually more complex than that, because if you're looking at Aristotle again, the difference between the bad forms and the good forms of government have to do with I or we. The good forms all have a strong we. The kingdom is good, the tyrant is bad. Again, not because of the structure, but because it is driven by I or we. And those are things that present themselves as part of the complexity of who we are as human beings.
I was tempted to ask the women on the call how much they were able to fully express their female leadership traits.
No. This is just like a comment, not from my experience, but when I was working on a corporation for about 6 years, I just noticed that it seems to be hard for the female executives to really have an influence. Maybe because I was in an industry that is very male dominated, but we only usually had like one vice president that was a female in a group of 10, 15. And they usually didn't last. I mean, you can see the guys were there for 5, 6, 7 years. They were rotating 1.5 years a woman and then another one. It was just kind of hard. And for me, being a rising manager, it was very demotivating to see that, because you can feel that influence throughout the organization. And we even saw that with the previous speaker just mentioned about the good and the positive and the not so positive female traits. When we had an accommodating female there, it was even worse for the woman in the company.
And Sean?
Well, I want to thank everyone. My practical experience in my career is that inevitably I found it very hard to engage in discussions about conceptual frameworks, about these fundamental issues in the context of work and in the context of my day-to-day life, because they seemed so remote. They seemed so remote from the sort of concrete decisions that we needed to make. And I found in the earlier part of my career that it was very clear to me the challenges that I faced that were extremely practical and sort of day-to-day. Increasingly, I find that it is actually the lack of this conceptual framework, the lack of this language to have a conversation about these fundamental issues that actually is really holding us back in a practical way in the workforce. And that, while I spend my day making minute decisions about how many people to have in a meeting and whether to involve everybody before involving some, and whether to send a message to them and consult or not, or these kind of very mechanical decisions. I think that as a leader of an organization, we have our responsibility mirrors this question and this problem that we have, and that therefore we have to do two things. One is we have to demonstrate to people practical ways in which there are ways of coming to consultative decisions, resolving disputes, to offer them as a model. And secondly, we have to, as leaders, paint for people a vision that they, in our own organizations, in our own teams, in our own little ways, can agree on. And we have to help people to find a language which allows them to develop a shared framework for understanding these kinds of problems. So I'm feeling now in my day-to-day life, I have to say, the lack of this kind of a language to talk with people, the lack of a shared language, and the need for these kinds of frameworks, and the value of addressing these fundamental issues, not just dealing with things at the surface level of practicalities, increasingly useful and increasingly important. And when I do turn to those fundamental issues, when I do question them, when I do raise them, when I speak in that language, I find that the children fighting over the flute are better able to co-create a solution and to find some, meaningful and acceptable resolution to those challenges.
Fantastic. Sean, thank you very much. As you said, thank you very much for this intercontinental presence. I think the youngest participant is about 2 years old. And the oldest, we won't say what the oldest is old, but typically BBF, from youth to maturity across continents. Sean, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody.